Dilemmas about translation do not have definitive right answers, although there can be unambiguously wrong ones if misreadings of the original are involved. Any translation, except machine translation, a different case, must pass through the mind of a translator, and that mind inevitably contains its own store of perceptions, memories, and values. Weinberger pushes this insight further when he writes that every reading of every poem, regardless of language, is an act of translation into the reader's intellectual and emotional life. Then he goes still further, because a reader's mental life shifts over time, there's a sense in which the same poem cannot be read twice. Islamic world translation of material into Arabic expanded after the creation of Arabic script in the 5th century, and gained great importance with the rise of Islam and Islamic empires. Arab translation initially focused primarily on politics, rendering Persian, Greek, even Chinese and Indic diplomatic materials into Arabic. It later focused on translating classical Greek and Persian works, as well as some Chinese and Indian texts, into Arabic for scholarly study at major Islamic learning centers, such as the Al-Qarawiyyin, Fez, Morocco, Al-Azhar, Cairo, Egypt, and the Al-Nizamiyya of Baghdad. In terms of theory, Arabic translation drew heavily on earlier Near Eastern traditions as well as more contemporary Greek and Persian traditions. Arabic translation efforts and techniques are important to Western translation traditions due to centuries of close contacts and exchanges. Especially after the Renaissance, Europeans began more intensive study of Arabic and Persian translations of classical works as well as scientific and philosophical works of Arab and Oriental origins. Arabic and, to a lesser degree, Persian became important sources of material and perhaps of techniques for revitalized Western traditions, which in time would overtake the Islamic and Oriental traditions. In the 19th century, after the Middle East's Islamic clerics and copyists had conceded defeat in their centuries-old battle to contain the corrupting effects of the printing press, explosion in publishing ensued. Along with expanding secular education, printing transformed an overwhelmingly illiterate society into a partly literate one. In the past, the sheikhs and the government had exercised a monopoly over knowledge. Now an expanding elite benefited from a stream of information on virtually anything that interested. Here between 1880 and 1908, more than 600 newspapers and periodicals were founded in Egypt alone. The most prominent among them was al-Muqtadif, was the popular expression of a translation movement that had begun earlier in the century with military and medical manuals and highlights from the Enlightenment canon. Montesquieu's considerations on the Romans and Fenelon's Telemachus had been favorites, a translator who contributed mightily to the advance of the Islamic Enlightenment was the Egyptian cleric Rifa al-Tahtawi (1801–73), who had spent 5 years in Paris in the late 1820s, teaching religion to Muslim students. After returning to Cairo with the encouragement of Muhammad Ali (1769–1849), the Ottoman viceroy of Egypt, al-Tahtawi became head of the new school of languages and embarked on an intellectual revolution by initiating a program to translate some 2,000 European and Turkish volumes, ranging from ancient texts on geography and geometry to Voltaire's biography of Peter the Great, along with the Marseillaise and the entire Code Napoleon. This was the biggest, most meaningful importation of foreign thought into Arabic since Abbasid times, 750–1258. In France, al-Tahtawi had been struck by the way the French language was constantly renewing itself to fit modern ways of living, yet Arabic has its own sources of reinvention. The root system that Arabic shares with other Semitic tongues such as Hebrew is capable of expanding the meanings of words using structured consonantal variations. The word for airplane, for example, has the same root as the word for bird. The movement to translate English and European texts transformed the Arabic and Ottoman Turkish languages, and new words, simplified syntax, and directness came to be valued over the previous convolutions. Educated Arabs and Turks in the new professions and the modernized civil service expressed skepticism, writes Christopher de Bellaigue, with a freedom that is rarely witnessed today. No longer was legitimate knowledge defined by texts in the religious schools, interpreted for the most part with stultifying literalness. It had come to include virtually any intellectual production, anywhere in the world. One of the neologisms that, in a way, came to characterize the infusion of new ideas via translation was Darwiniya, or Darwinism. One of the most influential liberal Islamic thinkers of the time was Muhammad Abduh, 1849–1905, Egypt's senior judicial authority, its chief mufti, at the turn of the 20th century, and an admirer of Darwin, who in 1903 visited Darwin's exponent Herbert Spencer at his home in Brighton. Spencer's view of society as an organism with its own laws of evolution paralleled Abduh's ideas. After World War I, when Britain and France divided up the Middle East countries, apart from Turkey, between them, pursuant to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in violation of solemn wartime promises of post-war Arab autonomy, there came an immediate reaction. The Muslim Brotherhood emerged in Egypt. The House of Saud took over the Hijaz, and regimes led by army officers came to power in Iran and Turkey. The liberal currents of the modern Middle East, writes de Bellaigue, Islamism and militarism, received a major impetus from Western empire builders. As often happens in countries undergoing social crisis, the aspirations of the Muslim world's translators and modernizers, such as Muhammad Abduh, largely had to yield to retrograde currents. Fidelity and transparency, fidelity, or faithfulness, and felicity, or transparency, dual ideals in translation, are often, though not always, at odds. A 17th-century French critic coined the phrase les belles infidèles to suggest that translations, like women, can be either faithful or beautiful, but not both. Fidelity is the extent to which a translation accurately renders the meaning of the source text, without distortion. Transparency is the extent to which a translation appears to a native speaker of the target language to have originally been written in that language, and conforms to its grammar, syntax and idiom. Monsieur John Dryden, 1631–1700, wrote in his preface to the translation anthology Sylvate, where I have taken away some of expressions, and cut them shorter, it may possibly be on this consideration, that what was beautiful in the Greek or Latin would not appear so shining in the English, and, where I have enlarged them, I desire the false critics would not always think that those thoughts are wholly mine, but that either they are secretly in the poet, or may be fairly deduct from him, or at least, if both those considerations should fail, that my own is of a piece with his, and that if he were living, and an Englishman, they are such as he would probably have written. A translation that meets the criterion of fidelity, faithfulness, is said to be faithful. A translation that meets the criterion of transparency, idiomatic. Depending on the given translation, the two qualities may not be mutually exclusive. The criteria for judging the fidelity of a translation vary according to the subject, type and use of the text, its literary qualities, its social or historical context, etc. The criteria for judging the transparency of a translation appear more straightforward. An unidiomatic translation sounds wrong, and, in the extreme case of word-for-word translations generated by many machine translation systems, often results in patent nonsense. Nevertheless, in certain contexts a translator may consciously seek to produce a literal translation. Translators of literary, religious, or historic texts often adhere as closely as possible to the source text, stretching the limits of the target language to produce an unidiomatic text. Also, a translator may adopt expressions from the source language in order to provide local color. While current Western translation practice is dominated by the dual concepts of fidelity and transparency, this has not always been the case. There have been periods, especially in pre-classical Roman in the 18th century, when many translators stepped beyond the bounds of translation proper into the realm of adaptation. Adapted translation retains currency in some non-Western traditions. The Indian epic, the Ramayana, appears in many versions in the various Indian languages, and the stories are different in each. Similar examples are to be found in medieval Christian literature, which adjusted the text to local customs and mores. Many non-transparent translation theories draw on concepts from German Romanticism, the most obvious influence being the German theologian and philosopher Friedrich Schleiermacher. In his seminal lecture on the different methods of translation, 1813, he distinguished between translation methods that move the writer toward, i.e., transparency, and those that move the reader toward, i.e., an extreme fidelity to the foreignness of the source text. Schleiermacher favored the latter approach. He was motivated, however, not so much by a desire to embrace the foreign, as by a nationalist desire to oppose France's cultural domination and to promote German literature. In recent decades, prominent advocates of such non-transparent translation have included the French scholar Antoine Berman, who identified 12 deforming tendencies inherent in most prose translations, and the American theorist Lawrence Venuti, who has called on translators to apply foreignizing rather than domesticating translation strategies. Equivalence. The question of fidelity versus transparency has also been formulated in terms of, respectively, formal equivalence and dynamic equivalence, expressions associated with the translator Eugene Nida, originally coined to describe ways of translating the Bible, but the two approaches are applicable to any translation. Formal equivalence corresponds to metaphrase.